Hi everyone, and welcome to the first cloud takeaways of the Dutch Cloud Meetup. Today we have a very interesting session of Steef-Jan Wiggers, but first let me do a small introduction on what we are, who we are, and what we do. Basically my introduction, I'm Mike van Gaag, CTO at 350, also Microsoft MVP, and we host these sessions to give you guys some ideas on what we do and what we do in the Azure space, or maybe in the AWS space as well. A little shout out to our sponsors we have. We have 350 as a sponsor, SPS, Ibis Software van Bank, and Betabit here in the Netherlands. So we are a Dutch Cloud Meetup, so we are based mainly in the Netherlands, but we will also have foreign speakers regarding different topics as well. So a few minor things. Basically, we are streaming this live from LinkedIn, YouTube, and also from Twitter. Questions can be asked in the comments or the chats. So if you have questions during the session, just place them in the comments or in the chat, so we can address them after the talk of Steef-Jan. So without further ado, I will bring Steef-Jan into the stream. Hi, Steef-Jan.
Hello. Welcome. Nice.
Thank you for being here at first. We are hoping for a very interesting session. We had some questions from people on social media asking if it would be a one-slider. My guess it will not be a one-slider, but I think most people can answer the question by default already. But let's see what you will tell us today. So I will add your desktop.
Sure.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Well, this is a one slider. this is going to be a story about if you as a developer should care about Azure Cost. And you might have the answer already, but let me just work to that answer and then see if it aligns what you would think. So for those who are unfamiliar who I am, I like to run, so that's what you see on the slide as well. So I'm a runner. I haven't done that much because of the corona, or at least I've done running, but fortunately not running any real races. But fortunately I will be able to do that soon. There's one coming up in Boston, which is the Boston Marathon, so I'm looking forward to it. Okay, so in my day-to-day life, besides running and doing some other stuff, I'm working as a technical integration architect at a company called HSO. It's based in Veenendaal, although it's a global company. It focuses on, it's kind of an ISV. It does a lot of consultancy around Dynamics 365, financial operation, or financial and supply chain management these days, and customer engagement, so that's CRM. My job is predominantly integrating the Dynamics with other subsystems supporting the business processes. So that's what I kind of do. I've been doing integrations for 20 years now, starting off in BizTalk, on-prem, hybrid integrations or hybrid solutions, and then slowly into Azure the last 6 or 7 years. I used to be BizTalk MVP, but I'm now in Azure MVP. Besides that, I also work as a InfoQ cloud editor. So InfoQ is a website that's available globally. It's from QCon or Q Media. So they also organize events. InfoQ is kind of their website for content. So it contains podcasts, news items, articles, etc. about various cloud providers, public cloud providers, software languages, architecture, all kinds of stuff. It's what you can find there. It's available. You can look up. It's been translated also in multiple languages as well. I'm also part of a user group like Mike, so not the Dutch, the Cloud Azure Meetup. This is the Windows Azure user group, or Microsoft Azure user group. So it exists over 10 years now, and we organize more in-person events, not really offline events. And besides that, I am also an organizer or co-organizer of Azure Lowland. So you might have seen also the background. This is a yearly kind of one-day conference. It's in Utrecht this year, so we're going to do it in person again. The last edition last year was offline, or at least online, I would say. We were not able to do this offline. So yeah, if you're interested, Utrecht, 30th of June, we're doing this. It's a one-day event completely focused on Azure. Okay, with further ado, let's go into the session. So developers, I used to be a developer as well. We program, we test, we have a lot of worries, and an additional worry could be that we also have to think about money these days. So I've been in the business for 20 years. So I started off programming against mainframes, and then we had this client server thing, internet, .com, and now we basically have the cloud. And this means also that hosting of your software is somewhere in a data center of one of the public cloud providers. And you used to, worried about licensing and your laptop and what that cost, and your servers, and it's a lot of I would say capital expenditure, right? The investment had to be done up front. This is becoming less. You still need kind of a laptop, not even a workstation or anything anymore. But hosting your software, or bringing your solution, is more into a data center of one of your public cloud providers, and doesn't necessarily have to be something that you need to install, but you need to provision, and then through DevOps pipelines you push your software, and then it's hosted somewhere. So this becomes a change. So we're slowly moving to, or at least we are already, dealing with public cloud providers like Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud Platform. These are the three major public cloud providers. They, together have, much of the market space. So AWS is, of course, being one of the first public cloud providers, has the biggest market share, followed by Azure and Google. So we'll dive in a little bit about, those cloud providers as well, but in general, these are kind of the public cloud providers, regions globally that you would deploy your software to. So the goal, at least in this session, is not to talk about code, but we're going to talk about money. So we're talking about cost and stuff. And before I'm, going more into details of costs around cloud, I like to present a scenario. So this is a couple of years ago where I was working at a certain customer and they wanted to modernize their knowledge platform. So it was, you see here is the functional kind of outline of that knowledge platform. It was hosted on a server VM with Solar on it as a search engine, etc. And they wanted to basically modernize this solution of VMs and websites being hosted on them to something new, more platform as a service oriented. So this dealt around the knowledge platform for tax returns. So if you fill in your tax, you always want to pay less than you really need to. And this knowledge platform had all kinds of information for you to be able to deduct some of your tax that you had to pay. And one end was content creation. So this was being fed by a lot of content. So the tax laws, which are public, then there were some additional information being edited inside the CMS. And then it was pushed towards what's called a content constitution. And then in the end, it ended up in the knowledge base itself being exposed through an API to some front end, which the user could log into, and then he could, based on some search criteria, could be of aid of filling in his tax returns. So this is kind of the functional overview. And then we kind of had to create what's called a proof of concept or proof of architecture based on some building blocks you can find in Azure. So it would be app services, Cosmos DB, search, and you see that here, kind of the integration and matching and merging. So part of the content constitution was done through .NET code and hosted inside a function, then pushed into a graph for relations and a Cosmos DB for content itself, indexed by Azure Search, which is now Azure Cognitive Search. You got your web app, .NET APIs exposed towards front end. And ultimately, the solution architecture or this proof of concept of architecture led to something you see here. So you have your CMS output pushed towards a graph, which is one of the data models you have in Cosmos DB, and also the content data store itself, which is indexed. So instead of using Solar, it was a platform as a service capability with serverless components, or at least you have your Cosmos DB service now. Acting a cognitive search, or at least indexing of that content, and then you get basically an out-of-the-box API allowing you to do some searches. And related content was based on the graph, the relations between the content types. Now, having explained this, one of the aspects that came apparent, at least what the business wanted to know, of this modernization, not just the cost of implementation, but also what will be the running costs, or at least. The spell vary, it's not the table of contents, it's the total cost of ownership. And we kind of estimated that this would be around 1,000 to 1,300 euros based on support for the CMS software itself, where it was boxed on-prem, and with your Azure platform as a service components. So being search, app service, functions, and Cosmos DB based on a certain dimensioning and sizing led to this type of estimation. So this was cost, and a couple of years ago, also the business wanted to know, okay, if you're going to modernize this and put this out in front of our customers, with a front end and everything, what will the cost be? Because on one end, we have this subscription model for this knowledge base. So basically, when people log in, they pay for leveraging that knowledge base. On one end, you have your income, is basically what you would turn on or turn over as an income generated with your knowledge base being as a service you offer to your customers. On the other end, you have your running costs. And if you deduct one or the other, you'll have some margin. So that's why it was important for them also to know what is the cost of this solution once it's hosted and is running. So basically, we're talking about cost in cloud. So and cost is basically the consumption of services that you use. So this could be a virtual machine that is running based on the dimensioning. Virtual machine, as you know, is an infrastructure as a solution that AWS, Google, and Azure offer, and they have different types. It can be memory optimized, it can be performance optimized. They have all kinds of machines. Once you provision a machine like that with certain dimension you need, you're going to generate cost. But similarly, if you're, for instance, create a logic app, which is a workflow service in Azure, once it runs, you generate cost. Similarly, if you provision something like a SQL Azure managed instance, or you would create an API management that can host your proxies of your API. So this would be an additional layer on top of your APIs, bringing some more security and manageability, reporting, etc. is something you provision, has certain tiers, generates cost. Similarly, with a service-based namespace for your messaging, whether it's a topic or a queue, it will generate cost. Some of these services are like hourly or rated, as in once you turn them on, you pay by the hour, but usually you have these services running for quite a bit. For instance, a service-based namespace you would run in a month. Depending on the tier, you pay a certain amount of money. There are also services that, by default, don't cost you anything unless they start running. So with Cosmos DB, for instance, once you perform a query, or once you do an insert of, let's say, a JSON document, then it will cost you what's called a certain request unit. So some of these services have dimensions like request units for Cosmos DB or database transaction units, which is something that will generate cost. The dimensioning of those request units is basically something that Microsoft does on IOPS, on memory, and compute. So one RU is always the same. It always gives you this kind of performance, because RU is correlated to a certain cost. Similarly, if you do functions, so function execution is per gigabyte per second. So those are kind of dimensions that lead to a certain cost, depending on how many cents or microcents basically per RU or gigabytes per second. So these are kind of what you can see or define as cost. And when I was thinking about cost, I kind of thought, there's a kind of concepts around this. So one way would be, and similar to the scenario I explained, you have your cost prediction. So what will it cost? So if you start designing a solution, or you as a DevOps team like, okay, let's build a certain solution, then it could be that a business or at least you yourself might want to know, okay, what will this cost? Based on the workload you're going to land on your Azure services. Once you've done that, then basically your cloud spend starts, or your cost generation. And then you want to know, what are my costs actually? Because then you actually will know what they will be. And if you've got your solution running for a bit, you might even think about maybe cost optimization, or in general, when you do your design and when you start dimensioning and sizing and everything, what could you potentially save? So I would see it, as a cost prediction, generation, and optimization. And I will get back to this later on as well. So one of the things, if it comes to cost prediction, is something you all well known is the Azure Calculator. Any of the cloud providers have kind of calculators. If you start looking for a particular service, you can select those in the calculator, and then you can do your estimation. There's example scenarios where Microsoft, or at least this cloud provider, explains what potentially your cost could be. It all depends on what kind of workflow you're going to land, and maybe what type of, with the functions, what kind of hosting do you need? Is it dedicated hosting, or do you want to have consumption plan? That kind of stuff. So those are kind of the criteria that can help you calculate. But there's another thing. The calculator by itself is not sufficient, because once you set up your solution and you're following kind of the DevOps principles, will have multiple environments. So each of these environments, you'll have some of these components running. So you could use something like, at least what we're doing is using a calculation sheet. And then based on what you're going to choose, you can calculate the cost for certain environments. So this could help you giving a better overview of your total cost, because the calculator, you can select all of these services and do the calculator total overview. But if it comes to multiple environments, then this potentially can help, because it also depends on how you're going to size your different services on the different environments. Also depending on what kind of subscription you're going to choose, whether it's from a CSP or when it's through an enterprise agreement. So there's different agreements that you can have with regards to your subscriptions, which can also lead to different type of pricings. Then you have kind of, when you do your prediction, then it's kind of the cost management capability. You find in a portal that can help you see what your actually costs are. So through the cost analysis and overview, you can start, looking at some of your costs. What would really be helpful, leveraging the capabilities of here, is one of the things that I think is very important from the start of your project, is that you create a budget on top of your subscription. And you set certain thresholds in the beginning on certain amounts. You can set on the actual and forecasted amounts at a certain percentage of cost that you think would, fit for your environment, for instance, for your dev test environment. And at a certain point, when these costs are reached, even before you would expect it, you would get a signal. So it's a little bit reactive, but it does give you a kind of alert telling you, hey, you got, your cost is reaching the kind of budget you set up front. And maybe this is a budget that you agreed upon with one of your stakeholders or your business or the customer you work for, and say, okay, I don't mind if the cost for these environments are this amount of money in the beginning. And once it exceeds, you could potentially get an alert, like, being shown here, that, I'm the forecasted period, it's likely that I will cross over my budget. And I can look in it, or I understand, because I'm starting to onboard more and more Azure services for the solution we built. But still, it provides a kind of an insight of what your costs are. Similarly, and this is more in preview, you can generate reports based on the cost spent that you create through some of the charts that Microsoft provides. So this is kind of a new capability inside Azure, allowing you to create alerts based on, or generate reports for you on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, which you potentially can even share with people outside of the portal. So for instance, management, you can report to them, okay, these are the costs. Maybe some of the stakeholders in your team or your upper management of your client like to know what the weekly costs are of the cloud spend. This is potentially possible. Another feature and capability inside the cloud management is the cost analysis. This gives you an overview of all your services in your subscription, more fine-grained and broken down into what you see in coloring and what the cost in certain locations, resource groups, but also the service itself. And as you can see, you can scope this, if it's clear, kind of scoping on subscriptions. You can view accumulated costs or forecasted costs. You can choose months. You can add some filtering. You can do different displays. This is, as you can see, an area. So you can toy around about this. There's various ways of showing what your costs are, depending on how you want to have a look at this. And there's another preview feature which gives you more fine-grained insights in your cost per resource group, and it's the cost analysis preview that you can look into a certain resource group and what the actual costs are, as you can see in this this overview of some of the costs that are being generated of components that you're using for your solution. Another way of informing yourself or getting insight into cost is that you potentially do it yourself. So Azure provides what's called all kinds of REST APIs. A well-known one is the management Azure.com, and then through a provider, depending on what the provider is. For instance, Microsoft Billing, and then a billing account. The billing account is if it's attached to, let's say, your credit card. So we're not talking, or it could be an enterprise agreement or such, that you could query the cost yourself. And if you want to know the billing account name, if it's not visible, you can get it through a PowerShell command. You could do it through Cloud Shell in the cloud if you like, or through PowerShell, and then you log into that subscription. What's important with these APIs in general is that the authorization is through a token. So you create an app registration with the necessary scope and authorization, and also the necessary role inside your subscription. So for instance, a reader role would suffice. An example would be, I've created a function locally, and then through Postman, I'm calling it out, billing and querying account of a certain customer. I have a very limited payload that I post to provide me, kind of a solution, or at least a response like this, which they could further use to visualize, if you like, to create your own custom solution. This particular API, and these are all listed on the Microsoft documentation. So what the payload that you kind of need to provide is what kind of type. So you have to say, okay, is it daily filters or dimensions and tags. So it gives you some of the ways of providing a certain filter to get certain information out. Similarly with the type. So this allows you to potentially even do some of the getting the information yourself through APIs, and then connect that to some custom solution if you like. However, there's also ways of connecting the costs into, let's say, a Power BI app, and this is suitable for enterprise agreements. So the link is here. So if you, the slide deck will be shared later on, but you can have a look into it. But this is kind of an out-of-the-box application or a Power BI app that you can use to see into cost. Similarly, there's also a connector allowing you through Power BI desktop for customer agreements and enterprise agreements to get that data out, and then using kind of your own setup or reporting with regards to cost. If the out-of-the-box capability in Azure portal is not suffice, or you want to provide a different view, not depending on the portal, but something you build yourself. So this is all about looking or calculating your costs, looking into what your costs are, and potentially, if you have all that information, you can also start thinking about maybe cost savings. So if you look at infrastructure as code or infrastructure as a service, having those virtual machines, you can agree with them, similar with the way of hosting in the past, saying, okay, I want a certain agreement, like I want to reserve these instances of virtual machine for a year or 3-year period, and then you get a discount. So some of the other public cloud providers like AWS have this as well, like reserved instances, or that you commit to using some reasons for a certain period. The other benefit you can have if you've got your own licenses, that you, once you provision your virtual machine, that you would use your own licenses instead of the ones that Microsoft provides. So this gives you some benefits as well. So either reserved instances or hybrid benefits is something that you can look into. Or even what I recently heard someone told me, that you can even upgrade to more newer types of hardware in your for Azure, and then you get some discount. Well, it could be potentially even cheaper. The other thing you have to think about is right sizing and maybe share your resources, like a service-based namespace. For each environment, let's say you can have one where you can have all your topics in queue, etc., except for having multiple namespaces, because that would accumulate more costs. So you can think about sizing it in a way that it's suitable within your environments, but also just use one. Similarly, with an API management instance, or you can even think about the SQL Azure pool if you have multiple databases. These can all lead to having lesser cost than necessary. Another thing is automation. And what I mean by automation is leverage what's called an automation account, allowing you, for instance, to turn on a certain virtual machine at a certain hour, let's say at 8 o'clock in the morning, and shut them down around 6 o'clock. So only turn them on during, let's say, kind of business hours, and then shutting them down when they're not necessary during the evenings and the nights. Or even when you want to have on-demand virtual machines or environments that you need for testing purposes, and then scale them down or turn them off when you don't need them. So these can also lead to your cost savings. Another would be using monitoring budgets and alerts. Have a look into it. If it's software as a service kind of thing, cloud licenses, you can have some software around it, or think about solution there as well to save costs when they are not used. The other thing would be reduce insufficient code. So if you do peer review, you look at your code and you can think, okay, maybe this could be done more efficient, leading to less compute. And the other thing could be something like reviewing your support contract, depending on what type of support contract you have. You might even have third parties that maybe we should go to another vendor that also has managed services that might be even cheaper than the ones you currently have. Okay, that said, just a quick recap. So if you look at Azure Cost Management, its portfolio, you have your calculator, you have your cost management and billing capability inside the portal. You have APIs, you have the Azure Advisor that can also help you in identifying where costs could be saved. This is based under the hood with the well-architected framework, which one of the pillars is cost management, which I will get back to as well later on. And that's kind of what Microsoft provides. And if you look at other cloud providers like AWS, they also have like a complete set of services. So AWS calls it the AWS Cloud Financial Management Services. And they have all kinds of toolings, and you might be familiar. Hey, there's a cost explorer. Hey, they have cost and usage reporting. They have something that's called an AWS Billing Conductor, which is recently launched. They have all kinds of ways of showing what the costs are, how to inform you exactly, etc., etc. If you look at it, it's like, hey, this looks pretty similar to what Microsoft has to offer. And if you want to have a look yourself, you can always go to AWS Cost Management and have a look into their portfolio of services. Similarly, so the other big cloud provider is Google, and also they have all kinds of information, tooling, etc., for cost management, billing, etc. The terminology is kind of similar. Calculators, all kinds of tooling that they and information that they provide for you to have a good sense and control over your cost. The other topic I like to dive into, because cost management in the cloud is pretty interesting. I used to look at a program at RTLZ, that's a channel in the Netherlands, called The Prophet. So this is Mark Limonis, and he's an investor. And what he does, and this is also similar to this financial management of your cloud provider, is that he always looks at certain companies that are selling some kind of service or product. There's some people behind it and a process. So he always looks at people, process, and product, and invests in it. And at the end of the day, that company gets a profit, but so does he, because he invests in it, because he feels that if he helps them out, eventually it will lead to the fact that that business gets better, and then his investment gets some kind of return, and then he gets a profit too, hence the program. But it's all about people, process, and product. And what I want to dive into is not so much with regards to cloud management, the people, you as a developer as well, and others, and the products are as in tooling, but the process. And the process is something what's called financial operations. So there's even a foundation behind it, and FinOps is a term, and the FinOps organization can say, okay, it's a cloud financial management discipline, so a process basically, and a practice that you have to preach within your organization when it comes to financial management and cloud spend, leading to the maximum business value that this organization can get out of what it's spending in the cloud. And that's why the information and cost analysis is so important, because you look at what your spend is, and then based on your spend, you can decide if you need to dimension it differently, or maybe if it's virtual machines, you modernize it to a platform as a service solution, like I told about the scenario in the beginning. The FinOps is something similar to DevOps and some of the other ops things you might have heard. Foundation behind it. There's a set of principles. And these principles are in a way that your teams, like in any kind of constellation, they need to collaborate together. But they also need to look at what are the costs of functions they're building. And does this spend is one's responsibility. So responsible for building your software, you build it, you run it, basically. And this is you build it, but you also look at what the spend is, and if it justifies the investment of your client or your organization or whatsoever. So the decisions are driven by, as you can read here, by business value of what you build in the cloud. And this FinOps foundation, so the link here is as well, is that they have these principles and a whole set of information and stuff around it, how you could do this properly. And it's done, it's visualized in something that is here. This is also from the FinOps, and they have a kind of a life cycle where you talk about inform visibility allocation, something that you also saw in the, during the talk about the capabilities that Azure, but also the other cloud providers provide with their tooling, the optimization, the analysis of what you're doing, potentially cost savings, which I talked about, reserved instance and right-siding, the automation, that kind of stuff. What is the suitable workload for what you land in the cloud? And then ultimately you operate, you continuously look at what your costs are, and you might do some improvement. And what I find very interesting is this cultural aspect within this whole process. In the end of the day, you should always all be aware of the fact that something that it lands in the cloud costs money, and I think most of you guys are. It's important, and this awareness needs to be inside the team, but also the awareness should be created at the client and the customer. I sometimes notice that they just create a subscription, and you might be in these customers as well, and they don't look at cost at all until it's too late. It's like, hey, why is this bill so high? The other fundamentals inside Azure, this one I want to touch upon as well, it's what's called the well-architected framework. You might have heard about it. Any of the public cloud providers have this type of framework with certain pillars. So the pillars inside the Microsoft Azure well-architected framework are optimization of cost, operation excellence, which means something like the DevOps process, performance efficiency, the reliability, but also the security aspects. And if you dive more into these best practices to drive your workload quality, guess what? There's one pillar, and all the stuff that I talked about previously comes back into the benefits, the reserved instances, automation by shutting down what you don't need, right sizing, and potentially move some of your workloads that you initially lift and shifted from an on-premise data center to the cloud into something like a platform as a service, which I related to with my scenario in the beginning. And finally, and I think this is important too, and also for developers, and even I emphasize all the time in the engineering team, tag. Tagging is a good practice. You can tag like your resource group, your resource, everything. Why? Suppose you have, or assume you have a subscription which has solutions for various departments, and they're also responsible for the cost that is being generated in the cloud. If you don't tag at all, you don't know which kind of services or what generates what kind of cost for which department. So that's why tagging, for instance, helps a lot. So that's why I'm putting an emphasis that, tagging is a good practice. If you look into the well-architected framework and around cost management, you see something around policies, but you also see stuff around tagging. The other thing I like to touch upon as well is third-party. The reason I'm doing is that once you have your cloud spend and you're building up your solution and you're slowly pushing that to production and is running, some of the tools that can help you providing insights into what am I actually running. So what is running in the cloud? And some of these tools, at least the Cloud Docker, but also Service 360 and Azure Management Platform tooling, provide you not the documenting capability, but also includes billing metrics and what your spend is. So you can generate some kind of documentation and reporting for higher management if you do not want to build it yourself, either through using Power BI or creating a solution where you would call APIs yourself and then generate some type of report. You can also leverage third-party tooling, which are listed here. Similarly, the Cloud Control and Cast AI, for instance, are tooling that allow you to get your insights into what your cloud spend is and provide your different user interface and some other capability of getting some insight instead of using the portal. And the Cast AI, for instance, can even help you optimize costs of what you are running inside the cloud. So example, and for instance, the Service 360, that's an integration more geared towards Azure management for integration solutions. It has a Documenter capability part, which generates reports of what you have running. But what's interesting also is what your costs are. You can compare that with other costs. It provides you insight if you're underutilizing resources or in this right sizing and balancing, provides you the aid in it. So this is one example of a third-party tool that can add some value to in that aspect, for instance, for your ops teams. Another tool, which is Cloud Control. This is built by someone who's an MVP down under. He kind of showed, I've built up this product. It's called Cloud Control, allowing you to get insight into your costs for whether it's Azure or whether it's AWS or Google, providing you some of the capabilities that you can find inside, the portal or those public provided solutions as well. But this is a more custom built solution, which gives you a different viewpoint, allowing you to create custom reports. Gives you a custom Explorer tag report, has tagging been done properly, some recommendations. So this is more third-party tooling, allowing you to give you insights into what your cloud spend and costs are. So reporting is important. In the end of the day, what is actually being spent in the cloud for your business wants to know, okay, what have I spent versus what's running in the cloud and what value does it derive? And whether it's a third-party tooling or whether you leverage what's available inside the cloud or you're using Power BI connector, or there's multiple ways of visualizing and showing the information to inform people what the actual costs are, which is part of this FinOps processes. Okay, so what are kind of the takeaways of this session? Well, is this a one-slider? There's one question: should you care about cost? Of course, you should care about cost. However, it's not just a single responsibility of the developer itself. It's a team effort, right? It's a culture where everyone in your team, when building up a solution in the cloud, whether it's a small solution or a bigger solution, should be aware of costs, where everyone should be involved. And what I pointed out in this story as well is showing some of the tooling, whether it's third-party, out-of-the-box tooling through the portals, or whether it's something you would do with APIs, is that there's tooling and APIs and everything that helps you getting insights. And with regards to cost management, there's a process. There's a whole, FinOps, which is kind of the process, a foundation behind it. There's information that can help you in setting up that, operation part of, or at least the financials around your solutions as well. And notice that even cloud spend also impacts your code, meaning the way you build code could affect cost potentially. So that's why peer reviewing and everything is important, which I think is embedded also in the DevOps process. And finally, I think if you look at the well-architected framework and other frameworks that other cloud providers provide, cost management is kind of a key element in your solution design. That's what they all preach. They all say, hey, cost management, besides security, performance, operations of excellence, etc., is key for a sound solution. And finally, there are some resources. So with regards to cost optimization, you can even dive into Microsoft Learn. So one of the pillars of the well-architected framework has a MS Learn attached to it, which you can go through, and there's some modules which you can wade through and gives you kind of a sense of what's meant by cloud management inside Azure. There's a blog post, this is one I wrote. It also includes some of the stuff I told about what other cloud platforms offer with regards to cost management and governance. There's a book, and this is Cloud FinOps, so it's based on what also this FinOps organization kind of preaches. It's all harnessed into this book. I'm reading it currently, I've almost read it. It's kind of interesting, all think about financial operations. It's a little bit more of bookkeeping as well. So if you start reading it, might be, yeah, but I'm more like code and development, those FinOps. But if you read through it more, gives you a sense of what's meant by cloud management and financial operations. There's also a recent ZDNet article that dives into FinOps and kind of states, hey, there's this trend going on in financial operation. And it is a trend. In the DevOps and Cloud InfoQ trend report we created last year, 2021, in June, as you can see, maybe a bit small, but you see FinOps in the early stages, so the early phase stage. This is more up and coming. So cloud spend and cloud financials is becoming more and more apparent, not just in the Azure world, but in any cloud world. Costs matter, and that's why this whole FinOps movement starting to arise. It started a couple of years ago, this FinOps foundation, and it becomes really apparent now. So should developers care about cost? Again, the answer is yes. Okay, so in case you want to reach me, you might have some questions now, maybe you have some questions later around this particular topic. So there's ways where you can reach out to me or follow me. It's either through LinkedIn, Twitter, you can send me an email. If you're interested in what I write about InfoQ, you can click on that InfoQ editor button. Or if you're, like to learn what I've done, community-wise, you can click on that Microsoft button and then you find some information there. So that's kind of all my details. If you want to reach out to me or want to follow me. So this kind of ends the session. So I think it's around 40 minutes that I've talked about cloud and costs.
Yeah, thank you, Steef-Jan. Was a very interesting session.
Thank you.
And good to hear that some people think about cost as well before they develop something. One question. Every developer, every person that works with Azure has a major failure around cost. What's your major failure around cost?
Well, I can say because before I became an MVP, I got the Azure free trial subscription. At least I subscribed to it back in, I think, 2010 when it became publicly available. Turn it on. There's a threshold, of course, of your credit card, but at some point it was like, yeah, I'm almost out of cost, but I still want to do this demo. So I lifted it, and then of course I ended up with a bill of 200 or 300 euros, and then I had to go to my boss saying, hey, this is pretty important, this demo, but yeah, I've incurred some cost, and eventually he did pay it for me. But
Okay.
and then also another big cluster F is. And there's another company, we had some virtual machines running for a classroom training. And although it wasn't my classroom training, but in the end of the day, my manager called me saying, hey, why have we spent all our Microsoft credits for a virtual machine? What do you mean? Well, they haven't been turned off. So that's also, although it wasn't directly my mistake, but still it's like, if you don't have automation, right, turning off your virtual machine, then even, it can cost you even the granted credits you get from Microsoft being a training company. So
yeah, a lot of people forget that you can shut down for years. That's That's the most easiest one to save money. Just shut down your VMs when you're not using them.
Yeah, but if someone's not aware of it, or back in the days we didn't have automation account again, but still, some PowerShell script can do it. But
Yeah.
if you forget it.
Yeah, and another question. Maybe you have seen this in situations as well. So one of the things you mentioned during your talk is that you can share resources. For example, if you look at a service bus, you can share the namespace for different kind of applications or maybe different departments as well. How do you then do the chargeback? Because you also mentioned that you can do tagging. So you can, for example, set a tag department on a service bus, but in the situation where you would share that one, you don't have that clear insights anymore on how you could do that chargeback.
That's true. Yeah, I'm aware of what you're saying. Unfortunately, I haven't encountered it yet in the real practical world. So far, I've worked with dedicated subscriptions with workloads that are just charged back to one single department. So I haven't run into a larger setup, I would say, with also management group with different subscriptions, etc., where this becomes a more interesting stuff, or at least an interesting topic that I can share my experience on. I know what you mean, chargebacks and showbacks, but it's not what I've encountered yet in real life.
Okay, yeah, we see that happening very often with customers. They share resources and they don't want to do a regular chargeback, and then basically the cost reporting you have now are not that fancy enough to do real showing of which cost is for which department and everything else. So you end up using Power BI in our situation.
True. I did see some customer at a certain workshop we did that did show me what's kind of a Power BI, what you're telling me, saying this is what we see with costs and everything. In my particular field of work, if you look at the cloud adoption, right, and you do your strategy and you start moving towards the cloud, etc. I'm more when once the landing zone and everything's there, I'm coming into the picture, let's say, to build up the eventual solution and integration, etc. So if you look at the journey from beginning to the end, I assume that you're earlier in that life cycle and in that process than the moment that I arrive.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When it comes to chargeback, your financials and etc. So.
Okay, thanks. That were the questions. So for our side, we just want to mention that we already have a next one scheduled.
Cool.
It will be scheduled in May, where Misha Wetz and Wim Matthijssen will talk to us through the Azure Private Link and the Azure Private Endpoint, and what's so private about it. So we hope to see you there. And for people that would like to give a talk, just fill out the CFP. We are still searching for speakers. First-time speakers are also okay. So if you want to join, please join us, and maybe we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, Steef-Jan, again.
Thank you. Yes. Have a good day.
Until next time, guys.
Bye.